Tonight I'm going to share the single case that has haunted me for over a decade, because it left me more afraid than any trauma or tumor ever has. You'll hear how a routine exploratory surgery in Chicago turned into a race against something that didn't behave like a disease at all. By the end, you'll understand why the case files don't fit neatly into medical journals, why the specimen we removed vanished overnight, and why her blood type was never the same again. This is the one case I wish I could forget. It had been an uneventful night until the call came through. The sort of quiet shift where you start thinking maybe you'll make it to sunrise without anything out of the ordinary. I had spent the evening making rounds, checking on post-operative patients, answering routine questions about pain control and diet. The atmosphere had been calm, and at that point in my career I knew exactly how quickly that calm could break. Still, I wasn't prepared for how completely it would shatter when Sarah Jones came through the doors. She was 34, brought in by her husband after collapsing at home with sudden excruciating abdominal pain. By the time I first saw her in the emergency bay, her condition had already begun to decline. She was pale to the point that her lips showed almost no color. Her heart rate stayed in the 140s despite intravenous fluids. Her temperature climbed every time we checked it, and her blood pressure, though present, was unstable, swinging between low and dangerously low. The nurses rattled off numbers to me while trying to maintain IV lines, and for most of us this would usually look like a serious infection or an advanced abdominal emergency, but nothing fit perfectly. The CT scan gave us a glimpse of what we thought might be happening. Radiology paged me with the results. They had found a large mass in her lower abdomen, something too round and too uniform to be an abscess, but nothing that resembled the tumors I had seen countless times before. No clear edges, no ordinary density, no signs of spreading into bone. In short, it was there, taking up an alarming amount of space, but it was not recognizable. That uncertainty instantly changed the room. We moved from frustration to unease. Something about it carried weight beyond the usual worry of a complicated case. I remember looking at her numbers climbing upward. Her white cell count had surged far beyond what you would expect even in bad infections. Her body was fighting something, but no one could tell what. She looked at me only once while we prepped her, her eyes glazed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. It was the kind of look that told me she was sinking too fast. At that point, exploratory surgery wasn't just an option. It was the only way to learn what was killing her and, if possible, stop it that night. Usually a case like this brings a burst of focus. You gather your team, prepare the OR, anchor yourself in routine. I had done it so many times that the sequence was muscle memory, yet this time it felt heavier. The OR nurse handed me the checklist, and I caught myself pausing. 18 years of surgery had exposed me to ruptured organs, invasive cancers, massive trauma from car wrecks or gunshots. Your hands learn to steady even when adrenaline runs high. None of those prepared me for the sense I had before this incision. I couldn't name it then, but I knew there was no precedent in my experience for what we were about to open. I thought of past calls where something unexpected happened. A routine gallbladder case that bled far more than it should. An appendectomy where the appendix wasn't where it should be, buried in scar tissue from an old accident. Surprises happened often enough that you came to expect at least one twist each week. But there was a difference here. Those cases made sense once you saw them in context. This one refused to line up, and the explanation lurked just out of reach. Even as we wheeled Sarah toward the operating room, I felt more like someone entering unknown territory than a surgeon heading into a familiar theater. That's when I realized routine medicine had already stopped making sense. Before we ever touched a scalpel, the strangeness had taken hold of the case. All of us sensed it, though no one said so. We adjusted the lights, laid out the instruments, and prepared to enter the abdomen. It was in that moment, just before the first cut, that the air in the operating room felt charged, as though we were about to encounter something none of us had been trained to see. And soon enough inside her body, we did. When I opened her abdomen, the first thing I expected was the usual sight of inflamed tissue or pooled fluid. That's how exploratory surgery normally starts. You go in prepared to find something you already know how to handle. Instead, our lights revealed something entirely outside the order of what should exist inside a human body. Lying in the lower abdominal cavity was a mass that filled the space like an uninvited organ. It was large, close to the size of a football, and its surface wasn't still. It moved. Not in the way intestines shift gently under anesthesia, not the rhythmic beat of a vessel or the subtle motion of breathing. This thing contracted, expanded, and writhed, as though it followed a pattern only it understood. There was a moment where no one in the operating room spoke, which was unusual in itself. Normally, even tense cases come with muted dialogue, scalpel requests, suction adjustments, short words passing quickly along the scrub line. But as soon as everyone saw it, silence took over, and I could sense each of us processing the same thought. This wasn't a tumor. Tumors don't move like that. They don't resist. They don't look back at you. Running from its bulk was a cord-like connection into her intestinal tract. At first glance, it resembled a thick blood vessel or maybe some hardened strand of connective tissue, but the longer I looked, the more it reminded me of a parasite clinging to its host. That comparison sat heavy in the room. I remember thinking of how massive parasites can anchor themselves in animals, burrowing into living systems to feed. But medicine had no reference for a structure like this in a 34-year-old woman. The color unsettled me most. Dark green, so saturated it was nearly black at sections, hinting at depth instead of surface. When suction tips brushed too close, a thick fluid leaked out. It didn't behave like blood, didn't thin out, didn't disperse. It clung together and moved almost the way syrup would move down glass, slow and heavy. The smell was faint, not necrotic, like infection, not chemical like bile, but something in between. It coated the instruments that touched it with a sheen that caught the surgical lights in unnatural ways. I looked at my colleagues, and the expressions under their masks stayed rigid, eyes darting between me and the mass. In most complicated surgeries, experience gives a sort of guiding comfort. You know what abscesses look like, pale walls filled with pus. You know what malignancies look like, jagged growths pulling into surrounding tissue. This had none of those characteristics. Cysts are encased, abscesses are fragile, tumors are hard or invasive, but all of them are inert. They sit there waiting to be dissected. This thing almost seemed aware. Every surgeon learns to compartmentalize emotions. During cases, you can't hesitate when controlling bleeding. You can't let fear cloud your judgment when anatomy doesn't line up. Still, the sense that we weren't operating on a disease, but instead on something occupying her body with intent, crept into each of us. The atmosphere changed with that realization. My hand steadied the scalpel as if mechanics would be the same, but mentally I had entered territory without precedent. None of us said it outright, but we all shared that same impression. We were looking at an organ that shouldn't exist. It filled the space decisively, reacted to even the lightest contact, and seemed fixed there as though it belonged, but of course it didn't. It had no place in human anatomy, no explanation in pathology, no line in the textbooks. It simply existed, and we had opened a young woman's body to find it staring back at us in its own unnatural way. At that point, the only clear decision was to prepare to remove it. But we also knew instinctively that interacting with it would not resemble a simple resection of diseased tissue. And I was right. The moment our instruments made true contact, the strangeness sharpened into something far worse. It fought back, and what came out onto her organs proved this was more than alive. It was deliberate. The first time we tried to separate the cord-like attachment from her intestines, the suction tip brushed the surface of the mass. It reacted instantly. The contraction was violent, like a living muscle snapping tight around a bone. For an object we had convinced ourselves was just tissue, its movement was deliberate and forceful enough to make me pull my hand back. That was the moment I realized this was not going to behave like any lesion I had removed in almost 2 decades of surgery. And then came the fluid. A thick green substance began to seep from the spot we had touched. At first glance it looked like drainage, the way infected material will weep when a cyst wall is breached. But it didn't behave like any pus or blood I had ever seen. Instead of spreading out randomly across the cavity, this fluid ran in distinct paths. It moved calmly, without the splash or chaos of liquid under gravity, and flowed purposefully over her abdominal wall and across the visible loops of her intestines. Every single one of us stopped what we were doing to watch it. I expected it to smear and spread unevenly, the way bile leaks and leaves wide stains, or how peritoneal fluid diffuses across surfaces in a cloudy film. But this material did something I can still picture clearly today. It traced lines. Thin green tracks formed and then curved into geometric shapes. At first I thought it could be coincidence, a branching effect like the way water will follow low points. But symmetry appeared. Straight lines connected at sharp angles, circles closed perfectly on themselves. Within a minute of spreading, the fluid had arranged itself across the surface of her organs in marks that looked closer to language than to any biological process. There was no sound in the room during those moments except for the beeping of her monitor. Even those tones seemed sharper, like the air itself had grown brittle. Finally, one of my assistants whispered, "Are we seeing this?" His words barely rose above audible, but the silence gave them impact that still rings in memory. What do you say back when your own instinct is the same disbelief? I remember forcing myself to glance around the table. Every pair of eyes reflected the same stunned recognition that we could not deny what we saw forming right in front of us. Ordinarily, surgical fluids move without intention. Blood diffuses until clotting stops it. Exudates from infections seep in irregular pools. Bile stains everything it touches in uneven smears. There is no order, no geometry, and certainly no symmetry. What lay mapped across her body contradicted those fundamentals. Even the resident assisting me only a few years into training sensed the impossibility. He kept watching the lines curve into repeating shapes, each one crisp against the natural pink of her tissue, as though the abdomen itself had become a sheet for recording something we couldn't read. Some part of me wanted to interpret the marks, to find a familiar frame of reference. Our minds look for patterns in everything, numbers, letters, ancient scripts, but nothing aligned. The longer they settled into place, the more it felt like communication, not random chemical interaction, not residue, but a message. I had no way to prove that in the moment, yet all of us shared the uneasiness of being looked at by something we couldn't understand. The scalpel in my hand felt almost irrelevant, a tool designed for precision in a field where knowledge is the guiding constant. And here, knowledge abandoned me. You never train to interpret symbols in the midst of a critical surgery. Medical school teaches mechanics, anatomy, biochemistry, disease progression. The role of a surgeon is to excise, repair, suture, and stabilize. None of those skills gave me language for what fluid behaving in this way could mean. For the first time in all my years, I realized I was both surgeon and bystander. I was cutting into a body, but something else was speaking through it in patterns beyond my comprehension. The helplessness in that recognition went deeper than fear of losing the patient. It was the dread of facing something purposeful while utterly unequipped to respond. That was my main takeaway in those minutes. The entity, if I can call it that, wasn't just alive in the biological sense, it was aware. The contraction, the release of fluid, the deliberate writing across her organs, each step suggested a response to us, as though it knew we had disturbed it and wanted us to acknowledge its presence in return. And once that awareness sank in, we understood the urgency of separating Sarah from it completely. because if it was aware, it could continue to act. The only question left was whether we had the skill or even the right tools to remove something that behaved less like a tumor and more like a thinking presence fixed inside her body. The attempt to do so would become the most exhausting and harrowing fight I had ever led on an operating table. What would you do if the patient's only chance of survival depended on separating her from something that acted like it didn't want to let go? That was the exact position I found myself in as soon as we made the decision to remove the mass. Every cutter, clamp, and retractor became part of the most unusual fight I had ever taken part in on an operating table. Normally, when you're cutting out a tumor, it passively gives way, cancer grows aggressively, but it doesn't resist being removed. What we faced with Sarah was the opposite of passive. The cord attaching the thing to her intestinal tract seemed to tighten every time we tried to separate it, making the procedure more dangerous by the minute. The greatest challenge was how deeply intertwined that cord was with her tissue. At first it looked like a blood supply, something I could tie off and cut cleanly, but once I attempted to dissect it free, the mass contracted back toward her intestines. The effect was unnerving. Surrounding organs shifted in unnatural ways as though pulled off contour by something with its own strength. Each attempt to carefully peel it away displaced parts of her gut in directions that risked tearing or rupturing them. I had to cut with precision while simultaneously defending her healthy tissue from being dragged into the battle. The longer it went on, the more her vitals betrayed how much stress her body was under. The monitor would sound sharp alarms as her heart rate spiked and her pressure collapsed. We administered fluids, blood, and medications just to keep her numbers in a survivable range. For over an hour, it felt like walking a tightrope. If we let go too soon, she'd crash, but if we couldn't finish, the mass would continue to endanger her from the inside out. Every tick of the clock marked a minute she might not have. There was a distinct sound and sensation to every cut. Tumors normally slice with a resistance similar to cutting hard tissue. Cysts feel fragile and ready to burst. Abscesses collapse in your hands. But this mass responded more like living muscle. Each time I dissected a section free, the tissue tensed back against my instruments. It was as if it had tone, like an arm flexing under your hand. Even through surgical gloves, I felt that pushback and recognized how wrong it was. Organs don't fight you. Diseases don't resist relocation. This one did. At several points, her vitals dropped so dramatically I thought we were losing her. The monitor shifted from rapid beeps into alarming pauses. Twice she flatlined long enough that my anesthesiologist shouted for compressions, only for her rhythm to return once the grip of the mass loosened. It was impossible not to think the two events were tied. Her pulse weakened each time it pulled harder, then rallied when we won a few millimeters of separation. What haunted me most was the feeling that it was aware of these exchanges, as though it understood the battle between us wasn't just mechanical but purposeful. We worked through sweat, silence, and the constant sound of alarms. Each millimeter gained felt like tearing something that didn't want to be torn. I remember one assistant muttering that it felt more like detaching a living limb than resecting a tumor. That clipped comment stayed with me because in that moment it rang true. It didn't seem like pathology anymore. It seemed relational, host and guest, fighting over who would remain. Finally, after close to 90 minutes, the last fiber gave way. We lifted the mass free, heavy and slow, and placed it into a specimen container on the back table. It continued to twist faintly inside that jar, subtle ripples moving under its surface, impossible and undeniable at the same time. For just a few seconds we all stared at it until the anesthesiologist called my attention back to the monitors. Sarah's vitals had stabilized. Her blood pressure, which had been fighting collapse all night, suddenly held firm. Her rapid heart rate slowed into normal range. Her fever curve flatlined. It was as if the sole presence of that mass inside her had been the trigger for every symptom, and once gone, her body reclaimed balance instantly. We took the container away, marking it carefully for pathology as protocol demanded. and began closing her incision. I remember the strange sense of relief washing through me, not just because she lived through what we thought improbable, but because for the first time that night I believed the worst was over. Of course, I didn't know then that this was only the beginning and that what we had placed safely into storage would not stay there. When the surgery ended, protocol guided our next steps. Any specimen that unusual goes straight into a sealed container, labeled and locked in the pathology storage until the lab opens the next morning. I remember double-checking the seal myself. We placed the container in a steel cabinet built specifically for these situations, locked it, and logged it in the chain of custody sheet. Procedures existed for a reason, keeping track of evidence, ruling out mix-ups, establishing accountability. By the time I left the hospital, I felt shaken, but at least reassured that whatever that mass had been, it was secured and waiting for analysis. The following morning, I headed back in earlier than usual, and I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's surgery, about the mass lying inside a jar, just a few steps away from the pathology wing. I wanted to make sure the specimen was cataloged quickly and looked at by experts who could provide answers. Pathology opened at 7 a.m., and by then several of us had already gathered around the cabinet. That's when unease turned into confusion. The container was gone. Not broken or misplaced on another shelf, the entire jar no longer existed inside the locked cabinet where we had placed it only hours before. We checked the logs. My signature was there with the time, the description, the exact cabinet number. Cabinets like those don't open accidentally. They require a code and a key, both of which are tracked. Yet, when the pathologist opened it that morning, the space where our container sat was perfectly empty. No signs of tampering, no broken seals, no force. It was as if the jar had never been placed there at all. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The head nurse looked at me, then down at her clipboard, then back again. I remember the silence being louder than the beeping monitors from the nearby ward. The lab manager finally muttered something about mislabeling errors. "It happens," he said almost too quickly. But I knew, and everyone else in that room knew, there was no mislabel. We had witnessed the container sealed, transported, and locked. The nurse who carried it confirmed it. The resident confirmed it. I confirmed it. And yet, gone. The hospital administration leaned on the simplest explanation. They told us a specimen likely got misplaced on another shelf or mislabeled or archived without proper record. Their answers were flat, almost rehearsed, designed to close the subject. Only later did I talk to a member of security who admitted there was no record of anyone entering that lab during the night. Not a single card swipe, no door alarms, no footage of maintenance. And yet, the container wasn't there. I didn't push harder, partly because I already knew such a conversation would end the same way, with a shrug filed under clerical error. That might have been strange enough, but Sarah's labs later added something even more impossible. Her blood work before surgery recorded her as O positive, confirmed twice during initial workup. After surgery, when routine labs ran again, the report listed O negative. The resident assumed it was a clerical mistake, so the test was repeated. Same result, O negative. Blood type is considered one of the fixed facts of human biology. It's inherited, coded, permanent. It doesn't mutate, it doesn't drift, it doesn't shift from one variant into another. For Sarah, somehow, it had. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the first test was wrong. Maybe the follow-up was wrong. But multiple confirmations across different machines, different draw sites, on different days said otherwise. Every time her blood was tested after that night, it came back O negative. I carried that fact in my mind like a stone, immovable but unexplainable, weighing heavier each time I remembered it. Her husband was present for some of those follow-ups. He seemed shaken but grateful she was alive. One afternoon while she rested, he pulled me aside and admitted something he hadn't told anyone else. She had been having strange dreams. Dreams of existing in two places at once. One identity in her bed at home, another unseen somewhere else, living a second life. He said she woke up confused, describing sensations of standing in one room and lying in another at the same time. He told me this not as a complaint, but as a whisper, like saying it too loudly might make it worse. That conversation unsettled me more than I let him know. The mass was gone, but its absence carried new consequences, the fluid, the writing, the sudden normalization of her vitals, the vanished specimen, the rewritten biology. Now, even her dream life had started to fracture into something unrecognizable, and the truth I kept circling back to was unnerving. It had never been just the mass that was unnatural. Sarah herself had changed. Standing outside her room that day, I realized that medicine no longer gave me the framework to explain what we had witnessed. Textbooks couldn't answer where the container had gone. Training couldn't explain the new blood type. And no journal on Earth could print the story of what we saw written across her organs when the green fluid spread. It all added up to a reality that felt heavier than the science I trusted. And for the first time, I wondered how many other patients carried secrets in their bodies we would never recognize until it was too late. The mass left behind no proof. There were no photographs, no slides under a microscope, no laboratory report, only Sarah's body carrying changes no one could reconcile. Her recovery was rapid, but the blood type shift and the scar she now bore refused to match the clean narrative of survival we usually give patients. I think about it often, where it came from, what its purpose was, and if it remains alive somewhere unseen. If one woman carried this without warning, could others? Some illnesses seek treatment, others hide, and I can't ignore the possibility that not every disease wants to be cured.